Dr. Sarah Chen had seen many things during her 15 years as a xenobiologist on Research Station Kepler 442b, but nothing had prepared her for the sight before her. The massive creature, easily twice the size of a terrestrial grizzly bear, lay bleeding on the metallic floor of her laboratory's entrance. Its obsidian-black fur was matted with a viscous, silver substance that she recognized as Vorthak blood. The Vorthak were apex predators, known throughout the galaxy for their incredible hunting prowess and fierce territorial nature. They possessed retractable claws that could slice through titanium, powerful jaws filled with serrated teeth, and eyes that could track movement in complete darkness. Most species gave them a wide berth, and for good reason. Yet here one was, clearly dying, and it had somehow made its way to a remote research facility. Sarah approached cautiously, her medical scanner in hand. The creature's breathing was labored, and she could see several deep wounds across its torso. But what caught her attention most were the sounds coming from beneath the Vorthak's massive body. Soft, mewling sounds, barely audible above the creature's ragged breathing. As she drew closer, the Vorthak's eyes opened. They were a striking amber color, and instead of the aggressive glow she expected, she saw something else entirely: desperation. The creature's gaze locked onto hers, and slowly, deliberately, it began to shift its weight. Beneath the dying predator were two small cubs, no larger than house cats. Their fur was a lighter shade of gray, and their eyes hadn't even opened yet. They were completely helpless, pressing against their mother's warmth and crying softly for milk they would never receive. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. The Vorthak had somehow known it was dying and had brought its cubs to her. But why? How could it possibly trust a human, a species it had never encountered before? The mother Vorthak made a sound then, a low rumbling that seemed to come from deep within her chest. It wasn't threatening, it was almost pleading. With tremendous effort, the creature nudged one of the cubs toward Sarah with her massive snout. The message was clear: take care of them. Sarah had studied Vorthak behavior for years through remote observations and recovered footage. She knew they were incredibly intelligent, with complex social structures and emotional bonds that rivaled those of dolphins or elephants. But this level of cross-species trust was unprecedented. The mother was literally entrusting the survival of her genetic legacy to a being she had never met. The xenobiologist's hands trembled as she reached out toward the cubs. The moment her fingers made contact with the first cub's soft fur, the mother Vorthak's breathing seemed to ease slightly. The great predator's eyes never left Sarah's face, as if memorizing the features of the being who would care for her young. Over the next hour, Sarah worked frantically to save the mother, using every medical technique in her arsenal. But the wounds were too severe, the blood loss too great. As the station's artificial dawn broke through the observation windows, the mother Vorthak took her final breath, her amber eyes closing for the last time. Sarah found herself alone with two orphaned cubs of one of the galaxy's most feared predators. She had no idea how to care for them, no understanding of their dietary needs or behavioral requirements. Yet as she looked down at the small, vulnerable creatures that now depended entirely on her, she felt a determination she had never experienced before. The first challenge came immediately. The cubs were hungry, and she had no Vorthak milk substitute. Working quickly, she analyzed samples of the mother's milk using her laboratory equipment. The composition was unlike anything she had encountered, high in proteins and complex amino acids that she recognized from her studies of apex predator physiology. Using the station's molecular synthesizer, she began creating a formula that might sustain the cubs. It took 17 attempts before she produced something they would accept, and even then, she wasn't sure it would provide adequate nutrition. The cubs, which she decided to name Shadow and Storm based on their slightly different colorations, were surprisingly vocal. They communicated through a series of chirps, growls, and purrs that seemed to convey different emotional states. When they were hungry, they made sharp, demanding sounds. When content, they purred in a way that reminded her of oversized cats. And when frightened, they emitted a high-pitched whine that tugged at her heart. As days passed, Sarah began to notice remarkable things about the cubs. They learned incredibly quickly, adapting to their new environment with a speed that surpassed even the most intelligent Earth animals she had studied. Within a week, they had learned to recognize her footsteps and would rush to greet her whenever she entered their makeshift nursery. More surprisingly, they seemed to understand that she was trying to help them. When she administered medicine or performed health checks, they remained calm and cooperative, as if they instinctively trusted her intentions. This was particularly remarkable given that Vorthak were known for their aggressive response to any perceived threat. The cubs' rapid development soon presented new challenges. By their third week, their eyes had opened, revealing the same striking amber color as their mother's. Their claws, while still small, were already sharp enough to scratch the metal surfaces of their enclosure, and their appetites were growing exponentially. Sarah realized she would need to teach them to hunt, but how could a human possibly instruct apex predators in their natural behaviors? She began by observing their play patterns, noting how they stalked each other and practiced pouncing motions. Their instincts were clearly intact, but they needed guidance in channeling these behaviors effectively. She started by creating simple puzzles that required them to use their natural hunting skills to obtain food. Hidden treats, moving targets, and obstacle courses that mimicked natural hunting scenarios. The cubs took to these challenges with enthusiasm, their competitive nature driving them to excel. But as they grew larger and stronger, Sarah began to worry about the future. What would happen when they became full-grown Vorthak? Would they still remember her kindness, or would their predatory nature override the bonds they were forming? She pushed these concerns aside, focusing instead on the day-to-day care that was consuming her life. The cubs had transformed her existence completely. Where once she had spent her days analyzing data and conducting remote observations, she now found herself playing surrogate mother to two of the galaxy's most dangerous predators. And despite the challenges, despite the uncertainty, she had never felt more fulfilled. As Shadow and Storm approached their second month of life, they had grown to the size of medium dogs. Their coordination had improved dramatically, and they were beginning to exhibit the graceful, predatory movements that made adult Vorthak so formidable. Yet with Sarah, they remained gentle and affectionate, often curling up beside her while she worked, their purring providing a comforting background to her research. The station's AI had initially flagged her activities as potentially dangerous, recommending that she contact the Galactic Wildlife Authority for assistance. But Sarah had declined, unwilling to risk the cubs being separated or placed in some sterile research facility. She had made a promise to their dying mother, and she intended to keep it, no matter where it led. 3 months after their mother's death, Shadow and Storm had grown beyond Sarah's wildest expectations. They now stood nearly waist-high and possessed the lean, muscular build characteristic of young Vorthak. Their amber eyes had developed the intense focus she remembered from their mother, yet they still looked at her with unmistakable affection and trust. The cubs had begun exhibiting behaviors that fascinated Sarah as a scientist, but worried her as their caretaker. They were starting to establish a pack hierarchy, with Storm emerging as the slightly more dominant of the two. More concerning was their increasing interest in hunting live prey, demonstrated by their persistent attempts to catch the small maintenance drones that serviced the station. Sarah knew she was approaching a critical juncture. The cubs needed to learn proper hunting techniques, but the station's sterile environment offered little opportunity for such education. After weeks of internal debate, she made a decision that would have seemed impossible months earlier. She would take them to the planet's surface. Kepler 442b's wilderness was vast and largely unexplored. The planet hosted a variety of indigenous species that could serve as appropriate prey for young Vorthak. More importantly, the natural environment would allow Shadow and Storm to develop the skills they would need to survive as adults. The first expedition was carefully planned. Sarah equipped herself with a full environmental suit and emergency beacon, while the cubs wore specially designed tracking collars that would allow her to monitor their vital signs and location. She had chosen a clearing near a fresh water source, surrounded by dense forest that teemed with small to medium-sized wildlife. The moment they emerged from the shuttle, the cubs' transformation was immediate and startling. Their entire demeanor changed as they encountered the scents, sounds, and sensations of their natural environment. Their pupils dilated, their ears swiveled constantly to track every sound, and their movements became fluid and purposeful. Shadow was the first to detect prey. His head snapped toward a cluster of bushes where Sarah's scanners indicated a rabbit-like creature was foraging. Without any instruction from her, he dropped into a perfect hunting crouch, his body low to the ground and his muscles coiled for action. Storm quickly noticed his brother's posture and moved to flank the target, displaying an instinctive understanding of pack hunting tactics. Sarah watched in amazement as the cubs executed a flawless hunt. They moved with patience and precision, communicating through subtle body language and barely audible sounds. When they finally struck, their coordination was perfect. Shadow drove the prey towards Storm, who made the kill with a swift bite to the neck. But what happened next surprised Sarah even more. Instead of immediately devouring their catch, both cubs looked back at her, their expressions expectant. They were waiting for her approval, treating her as the pack leader despite her obvious physical limitations. Only after she nodded did they begin to feed, and even then, Storm carried a portion of the kill to her, offering it as a member of the pack would to their leader. This pattern continued over several hunting expeditions. The cubs' skills improved rapidly, but they consistently deferred to Sarah's leadership. They would seek her permission before pursuing prey, share their kills with her, and position themselves protectively whenever they sensed potential danger. They had accepted her not just as their caretaker, but as their pack leader. As the cubs grew more confident in their abilities, Sarah began to notice other remarkable developments. They were learning to communicate with her in ways that went beyond simple Vorthak vocalizations. Shadow had developed a specific chirping sound that he used only to get her attention, while Storm had learned to mimic some of her verbal commands. More impressively, they had both learned to recognize and respond to human hand signals, creating a unique form of cross-species communication. Their emotional intelligence was equally remarkable. When Sarah was stressed or upset, they seemed to sense her mood and would respond with gentle nuzzling or purring. When she was working late in the laboratory, they would quietly position themselves nearby, providing silent companionship without interfering with her tasks. They had learned to read human body language and emotions with an accuracy that surpassed many domesticated Earth animals. But perhaps most surprising was their protective instinct toward her. During one surface expedition, Sarah encountered a pack of indigenous predators called razorbacks, aggressive creatures with sharp spines and venomous bites. Before she could even react, Shadow and Storm had positioned themselves between her and the threat, their hackles raised and low warning growls rumbling in their throats. The confrontation lasted only minutes. The razorbacks, despite their own predatory nature, recognized the Vorthak cubs as apex predators and retreated without a fight. But the incident highlighted something profound. These young Vorthak would fight to protect a human, a species they had never been programmed by evolution to defend. Word of Sarah's unique situation eventually reached the Galactic Research Council. Dr. Marcus Webb, a prominent xenopsychologist, arrived at the station with a team of researchers to document what he called the most significant development in interspecies bonding ever recorded. He was particularly interested in the cubs' apparent ability to override their species' natural aggression through learned behavior. Dr. Webb's studies confirmed what Sarah had observed. Brain scans of Shadow and Storm showed neural pathways that had never been documented in wild Vorthak. The areas associated with social bonding and cooperative behavior were unusually developed, while regions linked to territorial aggression showed reduced activity. The cubs were literally rewiring their own brains in response to their unusual upbringing. The research team also discovered that the cubs had developed enhanced problem-solving abilities beyond what was typical for their species. They could navigate complex puzzles, use simple tools, and even engage in what appeared to be abstract thinking. Dr. Webb theorized that constant interaction with a highly intelligent caretaker had accelerated their cognitive development. As Shadow and Storm approached their 6th month of life, they had reached the size of large dogs and showed all the physical capabilities of juvenile Vorthak. Their claws could now cut through steel, their jaws could crush bone, and their speed and agility were formidable. Yet with Sarah, they remained as gentle as house pets. The cubs had also developed distinct personalities. Shadow was more cautious and analytical, preferring to observe and plan before acting. He often served as the scout during their hunting expeditions and showed a particular aptitude for tracking. Storm was more impulsive and physical, quick to act and possessing incredible reflexes. He was the better hunter of the two, but also more likely to get into minor trouble through overconfidence. Despite their differences, the brothers worked together flawlessly. They had developed their own communication system that combined traditional Vorthak vocalizations with sounds they had learned from Sarah. They could coordinate complex activities without her input, and seemed to understand that their unique situation required them to behave differently from wild members of their species. The scientific community was divided about the implications of Sarah's work. Some researchers hailed it as proof that even the most aggressive species could be socialized through proper care and training. Others worried about the ethics of fundamentally altering a species' natural behavior patterns, arguing that Shadow and Storm were being denied their true nature. Sarah struggled with these concerns herself. Was she helping the cubs or harming them? Would they be able to integrate with their own kind if they ever encountered other Vorthak? Had she created two beings that belonged to neither the human nor Vorthak worlds? These questions became more pressing when long-range sensors detected a Vorthak pack moving through the system. For the first time since their mother's death, Shadow and Storm would have the opportunity to interact with their own kind. The encounter would test everything Sarah had taught them and determine whether the bonds they had formed could survive contact with their wild heritage. The approaching Vorthak pack consisted of 7 adults, including what appeared to be a dominant pair and their offspring from previous seasons. Sarah's long-range scanners tracked their movement as they made their way through the outer system, following ancient migration routes that brought them within range of Kepler 442b every few years. Shadow and Storm sensed their approach long before the pack arrived. Their behavior changed dramatically in ways that both fascinated and worried Sarah. They became restless, packing the station corridors and emitting low-frequency calls that she had never heard before. Their amber eyes took on an intensity that reminded her powerfully of their mother's final moments. Dr. Webb and his research team worked frantically to prepare for first contact. They established observation posts throughout the region where the pack was expected to make landfall, equipped with long-range cameras and audio recording devices. The scientific value of documenting an interaction between socialized and wild Vorthak was immense, but Sarah's concerns were more personal. She feared for the safety of the cubs she had raised and loved. The pack landed on the planet's surface 3 days later, touching down in a vast grassland region approximately 50 kilometers from Sarah's research station. Initial observations revealed typical Vorthak behavior. They established a temporary territory, began hunting local wildlife, and showed the complex social interactions that characterized their species. What made this pack unique was the presence of adolescent Vorthak, roughly the same age as Shadow and Storm. These young adults provided the perfect opportunity to observe how the cubs might interact with potential peers from their own species. Sarah faced an impossible decision. Every scientific protocol suggested that Shadow and Storm should be kept isolated until more was known about the wild pack's intentions. But she also recognized that this might be the cubs' only chance to learn about their heritage and possibly integrate with their own kind. After consulting with the research team, she decided on a carefully controlled approach. She would accompany Shadow and Storm to the edge of the pack's territory, allowing them to observe their wild relatives from a safe distance. If the interaction appeared positive, they might attempt closer contact under careful supervision. The journey to the observation point took most of a day, with Sarah and the cubs traveling in a modified hover vehicle equipped with emergency systems and communication equipment. As they drew closer to the pack's location, Shadow and Storm's excitement became almost palpable. They pressed against the vehicle's windows, their eyes fixed on the horizon where their relatives waited. The first visual contact occurred at sunset. Sarah positioned the vehicle on a ridge overlooking the grassland where the pack had made their temporary camp. Through powerful binoculars, she could see the 7 adult Vorthak engaged in various activities: grooming, hunting, and caring for their young. Shadow and Storm's reaction was immediate and intense. They began vocalizing using sounds Sarah had never heard before, complex harmonics that seemed to carry across the grassland despite the distance. Within minutes, the wild pack responded, their own calls echoing back across the landscape. What followed was a vocal exchange that lasted nearly an hour. The calls became increasingly sophisticated, incorporating tonal variations and rhythmic patterns that suggested a form of long-distance communication. Dr. Webb's equipment recorded everything, but even his advanced translation algorithms could only guess at the meaning of the exchange. The breakthrough came when the pack's dominant female began moving in their direction. She approached cautiously but deliberately, pausing occasionally to call back to her pack. Her body language suggested curiosity rather than aggression, and Sarah made the difficult decision to allow the encounter to proceed. Shadow and Storm were beside themselves with anticipation. They paced frantically within the vehicle, their calls becoming more urgent and excited. When Sarah finally opened the vehicle's doors, they bounded out immediately but stopped just outside, looking back at her for permission. Even in their excitement, they waited for their pack leader's approval. Sarah nodded, and the cubs moved toward the approaching female. The meeting occurred in the middle distance between the vehicle and the pack's camp, with Sarah watching through binoculars and the research team monitoring from concealed positions. The wild female was magnificent, easily twice the size of the cubs and carrying herself with the confident grace of a mature predator. When she reached Shadow and Storm, she began a careful inspection, circling them slowly while they remained submissively still. Her examination seemed to focus on their scent and general condition. What happened next surprised everyone. After completing her inspection, the female began grooming Shadow and Storm, licking their fur and nuzzling them in a display of acceptance that clearly marked them as part of her extended family. The cubs responded with purrs and gentle vocalizations, their relief and joy obvious even from a distance. Over the following hour, other members of the pack approached. Each adult went through a similar inspection and acceptance ritual, until Shadow and Storm had been formally welcomed by the entire group. The adolescent Vorthak were particularly interested in the cubs, engaging them in play behaviors that resembled the training exercises Sarah had developed. But the most remarkable moment came when the cubs suddenly broke away from the pack and ran back towards Sarah's position. They had remembered their human caretaker and wanted to include her in their reunion. Their actions caused considerable confusion among the wild Vorthak, who had likely never encountered a human before. The pack's reaction to Sarah was initially wary. Several adults positioned themselves protectively while the dominant pair approached for closer inspection. But Shadow and Storm's obvious affection for their human caretaker seemed to reassure the wild Vorthak. They observed how the cubs interacted with Sarah, noting their gentle behavior and clear trust. After what seemed like an eternity of tense observation, the pack's alpha male approached Sarah directly. He was enormous, easily the largest Vorthak she had ever seen, with scars that spoke of countless battles and hunts. His amber eyes studied her with an intelligence that was both alien and familiar. The moment of truth came when he extended his massive head toward her, allowing her to touch his muzzle in the same gesture of trust that Shadow and Storm's mother had made months earlier. The pack was accepting not just the cubs, but their human pack leader as well. Dr. Webb later called it the most significant moment in the history of interspecies relations. A wild pack of apex predators had chosen to trust a human based solely on the testimony of two cubs who had been raised by that human. It challenged everything the scientific community thought they knew about Vorthak's social behavior and intelligence. The next few days were a revelation. Shadow and Storm split their time between the pack and Sarah, serving as bridges between two completely different worlds. They learned traditional hunting techniques from their wild relatives while teaching them some of the problem-solving skills they had developed in captivity. The cultural exchange was unprecedented in xenological research. The cubs also served as translators in a sense, helping Sarah understand pack communication and behavior while explaining human concepts to their wild relatives. They demonstrated tool use, showed how to solve complex puzzles, and even taught some of the younger pack members to recognize human hand signals. But perhaps most importantly, they showed both species that cooperation and understanding were possible across the vast divide that separated their worlds. The pack began to incorporate some human concepts into their daily routines, while Sarah learned traditional Vorthak techniques for reading environmental signs and tracking prey. The arrangement might have continued indefinitely, but the pack's migration schedule demanded that they move on. As apex predators, they required vast territories and could not remain in one location for extended periods. The question became whether Shadow and Storm would choose to leave with their biological family or remain with their human caretaker. The cubs' decision, when it came, surprised everyone involved. They chose to split their loyalty, spending part of their time with the pack during migrations and returning to Sarah's station during the pack's dormant periods. They had created a unique solution that honored both their biological heritage and their emotional bonds. This hybrid lifestyle required careful coordination and communication between Sarah and the pack leaders. They established protocols for the cubs' transfers, ensuring their safety during both phases of their lives. The pack learned to accept periodic visits from human researchers, while Sarah adapted her schedule to accommodate the cubs' natural migration patterns. The solution was imperfect and required constant adjustment, but it worked. Shadow and Storm thrived in both environments, developing into magnificent examples of their species while maintaining the unique characteristics that made them special. They had become living proof that love, understanding, and patience could bridge even the most unlikely divides. 2 years had passed since the first contact with the wild pack, and Shadow and Storm had grown into magnificent adult Vorthak. They now stood nearly as tall as their wild relatives, their lean frames packed with muscle, and their amber eyes gleaming with the intelligence that made their species so formidable. Yet despite their imposing size and predatory capabilities, they remained gentle and affectionate with Sarah, greeting her return from research trips with purrs and nuzzles that would have terrified anyone unfamiliar with their unique relationship. The hybrid lifestyle had worked better than anyone had dared hope. During migration seasons, the cubs traveled with their adopted pack, learning traditional hunting grounds and ancient territorial markers that had been passed down through generations. They participated in pack hunts that ranged across multiple star systems, developing the stamina and coordination that made Vorthak such effective predators. But they always returned to Sarah's station, bringing with them new knowledge and experiences that enriched both their human caretakers' research and their own understanding of the universe. They had become living bridges between two species, translating concepts and behaviors in ways that would have been impossible without their unique upbringing. The arrangement had attracted attention from across the galaxy. Representatives from dozens of species came to study the unprecedented interspecies bond, hoping to apply similar principles to their own relations with other races. Sarah's research station had become an informal embassy for peaceful contact, with Shadow and Storm serving as proof that understanding and cooperation were possible even between the most unlikely partners. But this attention also brought unexpected challenges. The Galactic Council, concerned about the precedent being set, had begun discussing formal regulations for interspecies adoption and socialization. Some members argued that what Sarah had accomplished represented dangerous interference with natural evolutionary processes, while others saw it as humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization. The debate intensified when reports began circulating about other species attempting to replicate Sarah's success. Most of these efforts failed dramatically, sometimes with tragic consequences. The delicate balance required to raise apex predators safely was far more complex than many researchers had realized, and Shadow and Storm's success was beginning to look more like a miracle than a reproducible scientific achievement. Dr. Webb, who had continued studying the cubs throughout their development, published a comprehensive analysis that highlighted the unique factors that had made their integration possible. The timing of their mother's death, Sarah's extensive knowledge of Vorthak behavior, the cubs' exceptional intelligence, and even the isolated location of the research station had all contributed to the successful outcome. Attempts to recreate these conditions artificially had consistently failed. The scientific community's fascination with Shadow and Storm had also created unexpected diplomatic opportunities. When tensions arose between the human colonial authority and the Vorthak territorial collective over mining rights in disputed systems, both sides agreed to meet at Sarah's station. The sight of humans and Vorthak working together peacefully had helped diffuse several potentially dangerous confrontations. Shadow and Storm seemed to understand their role as ambassadors and took their responsibilities seriously. They had learned to modify their behavior depending on their audience, demonstrating fierce predatory skills to impress Vorthak delegations while showing gentle affection to reassure nervous human visitors. Their ability to switch between these modes at will showcased an emotional intelligence that surpassed many sentient species. The cubs had also developed their own unique culture, blending human and Vorthak elements in ways that reflected their dual heritage. They had created art forms that combined human abstract thinking with Vorthak sensory awareness, producing sculptures and arrangements that were meaningful to both species. Their innovations had inspired similar cross-cultural experiments throughout the galaxy. But perhaps most remarkably, they had begun teaching their techniques to younger members of their adopted pack. During their migrations, Shadow and Storm served as mentors to newly born cubs, passing on the problem-solving skills and emotional awareness they had learned from Sarah. They were creating a new generation of Vorthak with enhanced cooperative abilities and reduced aggression toward other species. This development had profound implications for the future of galactic civilization. If Shadow and Storm could successfully teach their hybrid skills to other Vorthak, it might be possible to establish peaceful relations with the entire species. The potential for expanded cooperation and understanding was enormous, but so were the risks if something went wrong. The test of their teaching abilities came when the pack encountered another group of Vorthak during their seasonal migration. This second pack was larger and more traditional, led by an ancient alpha who viewed any deviation from established behaviors as weakness. The confrontation that followed would determine whether Shadow and Storm's influence could spread beyond their immediate family. The meeting occurred on a neutral planet at the intersection of several migration routes. Both packs had legitimate claims to the hunting grounds, but territorial disputes between Vorthak groups were traditionally resolved through displays of dominance that often led to violence. Sarah, monitoring the situation from orbit, watched anxiously as the two groups approached each other across a vast plain. Shadow and Storm found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties. Their adopted pack looked to them for guidance, while the traditional pack viewed them with suspicion and hostility. The young Vorthak they had been mentoring watched nervously, uncertain whether their new cooperative behaviors would be accepted or rejected by their own kind. The confrontation began with traditional threat displays, both packs demonstrating their size and strength through coordinated movements and vocalizations. But when the displays escalated toward actual violence, Shadow and Storm intervened in a way that no one had anticipated. They moved between the two groups and began performing a complex behavioral sequence that combined elements from both human and Vorthak cultures. What followed was unprecedented in Vorthak history. Instead of fighting for territorial dominance, the two packs began a structured negotiation mediated by Shadow and Storm. The Cubs had essentially invented diplomacy for their species, creating a framework for resolving disputes without violence. The process took hours, but eventually both groups agreed to share the hunting grounds during different time periods. The success of this intervention had galactic implications. If Vorthak could learn to negotiate rather than fight, it would revolutionize their relations with other species and potentially end centuries of territorial conflicts. The Galactic Council immediately dispatched a team of diplomatic experts to study Shadow and Storm's techniques and determine whether they could be taught to other interspecies mediators. But the Cubs' greatest challenge was yet to come. Reports had reached them of a rogue Vorthak pack that had rejected all attempts at peaceful contact, instead embarking on a campaign of aggression that threatened several peaceful colonies. Traditional Vorthak society had no mechanism for dealing with such rogues, and other species lacked the strength to confront them directly. The Galactic Council formally requested that Shadow and Storm attempt to make contact with the rogue pack, hoping that their unique status might allow them to succeed where all other approaches had failed. The mission would be dangerous and unprecedented, requiring the Cubs to confront members of their own species who had chosen violence over cooperation. Sarah faced the most difficult decision of her life. She had raised Shadow and Storm with love and patience, watching them grow from helpless cubs into magnificent ambassadors for their species. Now she was being asked to send them into mortal danger for the greater good of galactic civilization. The choice would test every bond they had forged and every lesson they had learned together. The rogue pack had established itself on Kepler 186F, a frontier world where 3 different species maintained peaceful settlements. Their attacks had been systematic and brutal, targeting communication arrays and supply depots while avoiding direct confrontation with military forces. The pattern suggested intelligence and planning that made them far more dangerous than simple raiders. Sarah studied the tactical reports with growing dread. The rogue pack consisted of 12 adult Vorthak led by a massive alpha known only as Shadowclaw, distinguished by the black claws that had given him his name. Intelligence reports suggested he had been exiled from his original pack for excessive violence and had gathered other outcasts around him. They represented everything that Shadow and Storm had learned to reject. The Cubs themselves showed no fear when informed of the mission. They had spent years learning to bridge the gap between their wild heritage and their civilized upbringing, and they understood better than anyone the importance of preventing their species from being branded as irredeemably violent. Their amber eyes showed determination as they prepared for what might be their final mission together. The journey to Kepler 186F took 3 days aboard a specially modified diplomatic vessel. Shadow and Storm spent the time reviewing everything they knew about rogue Vorthak behavior, while Sarah and Dr. Webb worked on communication protocols that might allow them to establish contact without triggering an immediate attack. The Galactic Council had provided military backup, but everyone understood that force would only validate the rogues' belief in the supremacy of violence. The planet's surface showed the scars of the recent attacks. Burned settlements and destroyed infrastructure painted a grim picture of what uncontrolled Vorthak aggression could accomplish. The few surviving colonists had been evacuated, leaving behind a world that felt haunted by violence and fear. Shadow and Storm tracked the rogue pack to a mountainous region that provided excellent defensive positions and multiple escape routes. Their approach was careful and respectful, following traditional Vorthak protocols for requesting an audience with a rival pack. They announced themselves with long-distance calls that carried their names and lineage across the rocky terrain. The response was immediate and hostile. Shadowclaw himself emerged from a cave complex, flanked by his largest followers. He was even more imposing than the intelligence reports had suggested, his massive frame scarred by countless battles and his black claws gleaming in the alien sunlight. His amber eyes burned with a fury that seemed to encompass everything around him. The confrontation began with traditional challenge displays, but it quickly became clear that Shadowclaw had no interest in conventional interactions. He had recognized Shadow and Storm as the legendary socialized Vorthak and saw them as symbols of everything he despised about modern galactic civilization. To him, they represented weakness and betrayal of their species' proud heritage. The verbal exchange that followed was broadcast throughout the galaxy, as representatives from dozens of species watched to see whether diplomacy could triumph over violence. Shadowclaw spoke with eloquent fury about the corruption of Vorthak purity, the weakness of cooperation, and the necessity of maintaining their species' dominance through strength alone. His words carried the weight of ancient traditions and primal instincts. Shadow and Storm responded not with matching aggression, but with patient explanation of what they had learned during their unique upbringing. They spoke of the strength that came from understanding, the power of cooperation, and the opportunities that opened when species worked together rather than in opposition. Their words carried the wisdom of their experiences and the love they had learned from their human caretaker. But Shadowclaw was beyond reasoning. His response was swift and brutal, launching himself at Storm with claws extended and fangs bared. The younger Vorthak barely managed to dodge the attack, his superior agility compensating for his smaller size. The battle had begun, and with it the test of everything Shadow and Storm had learned. The fight was unlike anything Sarah had ever witnessed. Shadowclaw fought with the raw fury of a traditional apex predator, using brute strength and aggressive tactics that had served his species for millions of years. But Shadow and Storm fought as a coordinated team, using techniques they had learned from both human military strategy and Vorthak pack hunting methods. Their hybrid fighting style confused and frustrated Shadowclaw. He had expected either submission or traditional combat, but the Cubs' approach was unlike anything in Vorthak experience. They used the environment creatively, turned their opponent's aggression against him, and coordinated their attacks with a precision that seemed almost telepathic. The turning point came when other members of the rogue pack began to join the battle. Instead of overwhelming the Cubs, their intervention created opportunities for Shadow and Storm to demonstrate their most important skill, the ability to turn enemies into allies through understanding rather than force. One by one, the younger members of the rogue pack found themselves outmaneuvered and pinned by the Cubs, but instead of delivering killing blows, Shadow and Storm began talking to them. They spoke of the loneliness that came from constant conflict, the exhaustion of perpetual aggression, and the possibility of finding acceptance and purpose through cooperation. Their words found receptive audiences among Vorthak who had followed Shadowclaw out of desperation rather than conviction. These outcasts had joined the rogue pack because they felt rejected by traditional society, but Shadow and Storm offered them something different, the possibility of belonging without violence. The psychological battle was as important as the physical one. As more members of the rogue pack began to question their leader's path, Shadowclaw's isolation became apparent. His fury intensified, but it was now directed as much at his wavering followers as at the Cubs who had corrupted them. The final confrontation came when Shadowclaw, realizing he was losing control of his pack, attempted to kill one of his own followers who had shown interest in Shadow and Storm's message. This act of betrayal shattered the last bonds holding the rogue pack together, as even his most loyal supporters recognized that their leader had lost all sense of honor. Shadow and Storm intervened to protect the threatened pack member, but their defense was more than physical. They demonstrated the fundamental difference between their approach and Shadowclaw's by showing mercy to their defeated enemy. Instead of executing him as he expected, they offered him the same choice they had given his followers: redemption through understanding. Shadowclaw's final words were both defiant and tragic. He chose exile over redemption, disappearing into the wilderness alone rather than accepting the possibility that his worldview might be wrong. His departure marked the end of the rogue pack as a threat, but it also served as a reminder that not all conflicts could be resolved through diplomacy. The aftermath of the mission resonated throughout galactic civilization. The Cubs had not only prevented a war, but had demonstrated a new model for resolving interspecies conflicts. Their success led to the establishment of the Interspecies Diplomatic Corps, with Shadow and Storm serving as its first ambassadors. Years later, as Sarah watched her adopted children training a new generation of diplomats, she reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with a dying Vorthak mother's desperate trust. The Cubs had grown beyond her wildest dreams, becoming symbols of hope for a galaxy learning to overcome its differences through understanding and cooperation. The research station had been expanded into a full diplomatic academy, where representatives from dozens of species came to learn the principles that Shadow and Storm had pioneered. The Cubs themselves had become parents, raising their own young with the same blend of wild heritage and civilized wisdom that had shaped their own development. But perhaps most remarkably, they had never forgotten their origins. Each year, they returned to the exact spot where their mother had died, paying tribute to the desperate trust that had made everything possible. They brought their own cubs to this place, teaching them about the human who had become their grandmother and the sacrifice that had opened the path to a better future. Sarah had grown older, her hair now silver and her movements slower than they had once been. But her eyes still sparkled with the same curiosity and determination that had driven her to care for two helpless cubs all those years ago. She had witnessed the transformation of galactic civilization and played a crucial role in creating a more peaceful universe. As she watched Shadow and Storm's cubs playing in the research station's gardens, learning to solve puzzles and communicate across species barriers, Sarah knew that her greatest discovery had not been scientific but personal. Love, patience, and understanding could indeed bridge any divide, creating bonds that transcended biology and evolution. The dying Vorthak mother who had entrusted her cubs to a human stranger could never have anticipated the full consequences of her desperate gamble. But she had known something that her species had forgotten. Sometimes survival required not just strength, but trust. Her faith in an unknown alien had transformed not just her children's lives, but the entire galaxy's understanding of what was possible when different species chose cooperation over conflict. In the end, the predator who had entrusted her cubs to a human had given the galaxy its greatest gift: proof that love could triumph over instinct, that understanding could overcome aggression, and that the bonds between individuals could reshape the relationships between entire civilizations. Her legacy lived on in every diplomatic success, every peaceful contact, and every moment when former enemies chose to become friends instead.